I want to thank Leader Pelosi, as well as the members of the Senate Budget and Finance Committees, the ranking members, Senators Sanders and Wyden, as well as the ranking members of the House Ways and Means and Budget Committees, Congressmen Neal and Yarmouth. Now, beginning today, the Senate Budget Committee will start marking up their resolution, which will allow them to embark on a partisan product to cut taxes for the rich, raise them for the middle class, and blow a huge $1.5 trillion hole in the deficit. Republicans are on the floor and on TV misleading the public about their tax plan, but they aren't even telling the American people about another part of the budget: devastating cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. While the Republican tax plan would shower millionaires and huge corporations with tax cuts, it slashes a combined $1.5 trillion in Medicare and Medicaid, about $470 billion in Medicare, and a little more than $1 trillion in Medicaid. Tucked away in this corner, in this budget, which is right here, tucked away in this budget are $473 billion in cuts to Medicare and $1 trillion to cuts in Medicaid. The budget is summed up this way. This says it all. Republican budget priorities: tax breaks for billionaires, cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. We are here today with a simple message to our friends on the other side of the aisle. Your budget has it exactly backward. Instead of cutting taxes for the rich and cutting earned benefits for everybody else, we ought to be making sure that the wealthy pay their fair share, so that programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will be there for this generation and future generations. And this is, like Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. Republicans used their Trump Care bill to sneak in tax cuts for the rich, while they were officially desiccating Medicaid. Now they're using their tax cut plan, and they're public about tax cuts for the rich, and they're sneaking in cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. But it's the same playbook. And if they continue on this path, the American people will rise up against this plan as they have against health care. The number one reason health care was defeated was not just poor machinations by any particular leader. It's because the American people hated it. The American people are going to hate this plan because they don't want tax cuts for the rich, and they certainly don't want cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. So today, the six of us are calling on the President to uphold his repeated promises not to cut Medicare, not to cut Medicaid or Social Security. Over and over again, the President said in his campaign he's not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. This budget does just that. So we are sending the President a letter that says, reject this budget based on the promises of your campaign. Reject any cut in this budget to Medicare or Medicaid because you promised the American people that you would. And we await the President's answer. Leader Pelosi. Oh, that's, yeah. A lot of stuff here.
Thank you very much, Leader Schumer, for bringing us out together here. It's an honor to be here with you, with the ranking members on the Senate side of the Budget Committee, Mr. Sanders, and on the Finance Committee, Mr. Wyden. And on our side, I'm very honored to be here with our ranking member on budget, Mr. John Yarmouth of Kentucky, chair of the Bourbon Caucus, and with Richie Neal of...
How do you join?
Richie Neal, our ranking member on Ways and Means, of whom we're very proud. We're also joined by a senior member of the Budget Committee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who is also a member of the Appropriations Committee. Mr. Schumer mentioned our letter to the President, and this letter was sent to him today, signed by Mr. Schumer and Mr. Sanders, Mr. Wine, Pelosi, Yarmouth, Richie Neal, and Frank Pallone of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And I pointed out again because the letter not only says what Mr. Schumer mentioned, but these are the president's words. Medicare and Medicaid should not be used to finance new tax breaks for the wealthy, and we're saying in our letter, and we request that you pledge to veto any legislation that includes these cuts. That is what is in our letter, which references the president's own words. Now, this formulation that you see here, don't cut Medicare to finance tax cuts for the rich, is really what is in the DNA of the Republicans. They have never fully supported Medicare, even at its origin. In the late 90s, they had proposals that said Medicare should wither on the vine. Since his being chair of the Budget Committee, as well as Speaker Ryan has had in the budget, the Republican budget, a provision to remove the guarantee of Medicare. Medicare is a guarantee. You remove the guarantee, you don't have Medicare. Instead, he wants to give seniors a voucher. So Medicare and Medicaid are our nation's fundamental promise of dignity and security to seniors and working families. Again, as a leader said, nearly $500 billion, $500 billion in Medicare benefit cuts and $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts. But again, all of these Medicare and Medicaid cuts to give over $1 trillion in deficit exploding tax breaks to the wealthiest 1%. Again, throughout his campaign, and as recently as April, President Trump pledged that he would not touch Medicare. Today, House, again, we sent this letter. It would betray every pledge of solidarity with working families for the president to sign GOP legislation that devastates Medicare and Medicaid while handing tax breaks to billionaires. That is our focus today because it is the focus of America's working families. And with that, I'm very honored to yield to the distinguished ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Sanders.
Thank you very much, Leader Pelosi. Let me begin by telling you what my major fear is. My major fear is that at a time when the American people are focused on the horrors of what happened in Las Vegas, when people are terribly worried about the destruction in Puerto Rico, when people are worried about Russian influence in our 2016 election, people are worried about DACA, people are worried about North Korea. There's so much on the plate that the media is covering, appropriately so, that the Republicans just might be able to slip through the most horrific and destructive budget in the history of the United States of America. What this budget is about is transforming America. That's what it is about. This is no small thing. This is about moving this country into an oligarchic form of society in which we transfer trillions of dollars from the middle class and working families of this country to the top 1%. It is the Robin Hood principle in reverse. It takes from the poor and working families and gives to those people and large corporations who already have incredible wealth. Importantly, as both Chuck and Nancy pointed out, many Americans think that finally we beat back the Republican efforts to decimate health care in America, to take away health insurance from many millions of our fellow citizens. If you believe that, and if you are now relaxed and think that struggle is over, you are dead wrong. This legislation cuts $1 trillion from Medicaid, which would throw 15 million Americans off of the health insurance they currently have. They have brought back that health care struggle right into this budget. But now they are doing, as Chuck and Nancy indicated, something new that they have not yet done recently. Now they are going after senior citizens and making a cut in Medicare of over $450 billion. President Trump said during his campaign, I'm a different type of Republican. I'm not Paul Ryan. Hey, I'm a new type of Republican. I'm not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Well, Mr. President, that's what you told the American people. And I hope that today you will announce loudly and clearly that any bill containing cuts to Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security will be vetoed. Stop your friends in the Republican Party in the Senate and the House from wasting their time. Tell them you're going to veto that legislation because that is what you told the American people. But this legislation is not just about cutting Medicaid and Medicare. It's about cutting billions of dollars from the low-income home energy assistance program at a time when so many of our young people can't afford to go to college. And some of us think we should make public colleges and universities tuition-free. This legislation would cut $100 billion in Pell Grants, making it harder for young people to afford to go to college. It would cut the Women, Infant, and Children's Program. Low-income pregnant women who now get help to have healthy babies, they would see that program cut. So we have got to rally the American people to defeat this horrific legislation, which represents the priorities of the Koch brothers and billionaires. And we need legislation and a budget that stands with the middle class and working families of this country. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Representative John Yarmouth. John.
Of the Bourbon Caucus. Thank you, Senator Sanders. We are about to engage in a fascinating exercise today in the House. We're going to be debating a budget that virtually every Democrat opposes and which many Republicans oppose. The only difference is that Democrats are going to vote against it and the Republicans are all going to vote for it because they don't take this budget seriously. This is only a process to get to reconciliation for doing tax reform, they call it, but we know these are absolutely enormous tax cuts, the vast majority of which will go to the wealthiest Americans and corporations. You know, there are about half of the House of Representatives are millionaires, and millionaires under this budget will get, and I'm one of them, millionaires under this budget will get an average tax cut of $230,000. What will the average American get? The $50,000? 45% of them will actually end up paying more. So this is a course that will lead us to an even more disastrous policy, and a policy that ultimately will result in more cuts to these programs that we've been discussing today, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and others. Because what the Republicans will do is they're now claiming that these tax cuts will pay for themselves, which they never do, and which, by the way, CBO says they won't. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former CBO head, says they won't. Bruce Bartlett, who wrote Reaganomics, says they don't. As a matter of fact, he called them bull. At least that was half of what he called them. But they claim that they'll pay for themselves, which the House Republican budget, by the way, does claim. And when they don't, they will scream about debts and deficits, and they will push for more cuts to these programs that help so many millions of Americans. So we are all committed as Democrats to fighting this budget, which is built on so many false assumptions and premises that it actually fails the seriousness test. It actually even contemplates, it assumes the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and so they get rid of all the expenses of the Affordable Care Act. Well, obviously that's not going to happen. Again, they assume a revenue-neutral tax cut plus an economic bonus from that tax cut, a bonanza of $1.3 trillion. None of that will happen, but that's how silly this budget is. Unfortunately, it's very serious what they are attempting to do, which is cut trillions and trillions of dollars from wealthy Americans' taxes, again, and pay for it on the backs of hardworking, middle-class, and lower-income Americans. So we're going to fight this with all of our energy, and I hope, as everyone else has said, the President stands firm in his promise not to touch Medicare and Medicaid. Thank you. And I now get to introduce Senator Ron Wyden.
Thank you, Congressman. Our leadership has said it well, and it's good to be here with colleagues. First of all, just as Americans didn't want tax cuts for the wealthy disguised as health care, they are not going to support even bigger tax cuts for the wealthy paid for by health care. We beat the Trump health care scam twice, and we're going to beat him a third time on his tax scam. Republican plans to bust the budget to pay for the giveaways to the ultra-wealthy and the multinational companies is a recipe for disaster that would put the social safety net in tatters. Now, just a couple of points about the process that I think are particularly relevant. The budget instructions that are now being considered in the Senate say that the tax writing committees have got to move on a tax bill that fits the budget framework by November 13th. So that's a month away, when there's a tax bill that over the last few months has gone from essentially 1 page to a little more than 4 pages, because you got to take out some of the white space, which is what there's an awful lot, of. And, the reality is that this administration even goes beyond that, with key officials like Gary Cohn pretty much saying, this is our offer. And you say, what are you offering? There's no bill. And this is a big departure over what's happened previously. It is a big departure from how Ronald Reagan worked with scores of Democrats, one of whom calls frequently and asks what's going on. That's Bill Bradley, but it was Dan Rostenkowski. Democrats and Republicans worked together for months. And now Leader McConnell has abandoned regular order and just been out there with the so-called Gang of Six cooking up this tax bill that, as my colleagues have said, is so skewed to the 1%. I want it understood that both as a member of the Budget Committee and as ranking member of the Finance Committee, I'm going to keep calling for Chairman Hatch to hold transparent, bipartisan hearings on legislation, which to me seems like a modest request when you're talking about America's $18 trillion economy. I'll close with one point, because it's a point I agree with Mitch McConnell on. In 2010, Mitch McConnell said, with respect to spending and debt, the longer we wait to address the debt in a serious manner, the more that the safety net frays, and the harder this crisis will be to address. At some point, a choice has to be made, and that point is now. The time is now. It's time for Republicans to drop an extreme plan, unprecedented, in my view, in terms of stacking the deck against working class families. It ought to be set aside and to work together with the formula that has worked successfully for tax reform in the past, which is a plan that gives everybody in America the chance to get ahead, doesn't spill red ink every which way, and is pursued in a bipartisan way rather than through a partisan railroad. And now, my partner in all this, Rich Neal, everybody says if you're on the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, you're kind of involved in prolonged root canal work. But the fact is, Rich Neal talks about this in a way human beings and the American people get.
Thanks, Ron, very much. So this budget debate kicks off tax reform. One of the things that's been left out of the argument over tax reform is you need money to do tax reform. So the forecasts that have come from members of the House and the Senate don't square with suggestions for growth that come from any mainstream economists. At the White House last week, the president said, I don't know why we can't get to 4, 5, or 6% growth. All projections for this coming year are about 2.3%. They said that this was going to be about the middle class, as they took the top rate from 39.6 to 35, as they proposed repealing the estate tax, as they indicated they're going to end AMT. I take personal satisfaction on what we did with AMT as a party. 27 million middle-class Americans no longer pay AMT. It's down to about 5 million people. And I think that you've got to keep your eye on the intricacies of what they're going to propose and do over the next few weeks. And why is that important? Because even as of last night, the promising has begun. So you can choose whether you want to keep the mortgage interest deduction, or you can choose whether or not you want to keep the deduction for state and local taxes. This is precisely what went awry in the debate over the border adjustment tax. Both of these proposals on state and local tax deductions and border adjustment tax called for $1 trillion of new revenue, which then would allow them to do the things that they said they would do. None of this, however, at the moment, appears to offer any tax relief to people in middle income groups. In fact, if they are able to eliminate the deduction for state and local taxes, that's a tax increase on middle income Americans. Last point. We saw a tax cut of $2.3 trillion in 2001 and 2003, and it was all premised on the notion of economic growth. Well, the growth at the end of those 8 years was at about 1.8%. That's pretty anemic. And I understand this argument over the whole notion of tax burden. But what they're proposing to do here is to shift even more of the tax burden from the top 1% to people in the middle. If we don't understand the concentration of wealth that's taking place, and all economists, by the way, left, right, and center, all accept the notion that there's a greater concentration of wealth at the top. Our position is still, if you're going to offer relief, offer it to middle-income people, and let's use this tax debate to argue over investments in human capital. Community colleges, vocational education, more initiatives that are going to get people aligned with the 6 million jobs that now await them across America. That's what we should be talking about here, rather than this notion, as the Tax Foundation has correctly pointed out, that 70% of these benefits in the opening years go to people at the top, and as the tax cuts kick in over succeeding years, even more of the benefit goes to people at the top. Barbara Lee.
Well, thank you very much. Let me first thank our leadership for really sounding the alarm so the American people really understand and see what is taking place here with regard to this GOP budget. I'll be very brief, but one thing about this budget is that it does not create economic growth, nor does it create jobs, nor does it reduce the standard of living, the cost of living for anyone. Rather, it cuts Medicare, Medicaid, and we have to remember that 60% of Medicaid funds go for our seniors who are in nursing homes. This budget also creates a pathway into poverty for so many people who deserve our response to a budget to help lift people out of poverty. 40 million people living in poverty. This budget, it takes the safety net and it erodes it in a way that we have never seen before. So I'm hoping that the GOP, the Republicans, really understand that it's not only Democrats who are going to be hurt by this budget, it's independents, it's Republicans, it's working men and women, communities of color are going to be disproportionately hit by many of these cuts. And so I just want to thank our leadership for coming forward and sounding the alarm, because we should be talking about investing in human capital, investing in workforce training, apprenticeship training, education, and job creation. Rather, here we're talking about a budget that sets the stage for tax cuts for the millionaires and the billionaires. So thank you again very much.
Thank you, Barbara. We're ready for your questions. Questions? Yes, Taylor.
Do you have any basis in any public statements or private information that Republicans are actually going to try to implement many of these cuts that you're talking about? I mean, I know they're in the tables with the budget, but
Well, ask why they put them in. My guess. The hard right would not go along with this tax proposal unless there were cuts to entitlements. And they're going to continue to insist on it. And particularly, now they're running into other problems. As you see, there's sort of a rebellion among Republican Congress members on state and local deductibility. So they're going to have real problems. This is what they want to do, and we believe they will try to do it. As leader said, Paul Ryan's been trying to do this a long time. They're not going to be able to pass a budget that is just tax cuts. There are too many Republicans who want some degree of deficit. They don't want the deficit to run wild. And so this is what they propose to do. I believe they're going to be tied in it. Why would they put something so decidedly against what the president said, so unpopular in there? They had no choice. That same motivation is going to impel them to try and do some of this.
Chuck, can I just say one on that? Political scientists will argue that the most powerful political entity in America is not the Democratic Party. It is not the Republican Party. It's the Koch brothers. And the Koch brothers have spent, over a period of many years, billions of dollars pushing an agenda. And they're pretty clear about what their agenda is, which has everything to do with this budget. Their agenda is, we don't want to cut Social Security. Oh, no. We want to eliminate Social Security. We want to eliminate Medicare. We want to eliminate Medicaid. And if you don't think that the Koch brothers and their hundreds of millions of dollars are not influencing this debate, then you really don't know what's going on in American politics.
On another financial matter, the president said that they were willing to wipe Puerto Rico's debt clear of $72 billion. The director of OMB said, do not take the president's statement word for word, but rather they'd be delivering a package this afternoon for some aid to Puerto Rico to the tune of $16 to $29 billion. First, what do you think is the appropriate response to Puerto Rico financially?
Well, we on both sides of the, both in bicamerally, Democrats have been fighting for a fair solution to Puerto Rico's debt. And we've been thwarted as we've tried to bring that across. Now, maybe the horrible, horrible devastation that's been caused to Puerto Rico will make our colleagues understand that we have to have a far fairer solution to Puerto Rico's problems, and we look forward to working on those.
Can I ask you about, there's a proposal in this budget to open drilling in Anwar. It's been some time since Republicans have proposed in the Senate opening up Anwar. How do you see that playing out this time? Do Senate Democrats have the ability to attract moderates and block it again?
Well, I think it's going to be a tough fight for them to do it. There are some Republicans who have expressed, at least privately, some distaste for opening up Anwar. And their job is as long as they continue on the path of just trying to do this all with Republican votes, they just run into trouble every which way they turn. That's what happened with health care. That's going to happen here. And yet, again, because the hard right is so strong, they cannot put together a mainstream budget. They can't get the votes on the Republican side to do it, and I don't think the Republican leadership is, at this point, has the political ability or the strength to try and put together a bipartisan plan. I don't know, you want to say something, Nance?
Well, I did want to get back to the original question about why they do this. It's in their DNA. This is what they believe. Trickle-down economics is why they come to Washington. Eliminating, letting Medicare wither on the vine has been their mantra. As President Speaker, as chair of the Budget Committee, had the elimination of the Medicare guarantee in his proposal. Many of the members here voted to privatize Social Security. So understand that. But the opportunity cost of all of this, and this is what we're about in our budget, and I commend Mr. Yarmouth on our budget in the House and Mr. Sanders in the Senate. This is about opportunity, and this is about opportunity cost. One of the things they want to do is cut education. One of the dumbest things, with stiff competition, mind you, one of the dumbest things that they are proposing is to cut education, because nothing brings more money to the Treasury than investments in education, early childhood, K through 12, higher ed, lifetime learning for our workers. And that's the education that all of our colleagues have talked, that's the opportunity all of our colleagues have talked about that is missed in this budget. So when you ask about drilling and all the rest of that, understand that their motivation is what they believe. Starve the beast. We want to eliminate domestic investments, to give money to the high end, to benefit their sponsors, the fossil fuel industry, the gun industry. You just look at where the money flows to them, and you will see where their heart is on these issues. And it's not at the kitchen table with America's working families addressing their concerns.
Leader Pelosi, do you think that your deal with Trump on the DREAM Act and border security is in trouble? Conservatives in the Republican Party who had dinner with him the other night seem to think it's moving in a different direction.
Well, Mr. Schumer last night said on a show that we were on, if the president is walking away from it, he should tell us. But right. I believe that the president will commit to it. You know why? Because the American people are there. They believe in the dreamers. They understand that this isn't who we are as a country to send these people who came here as young people, and this is now their country. It's a beautiful thing that we would do this. And those people who said what they said, they weren't in the room. They couldn't possibly know. We know what the president said. We believe that he is committed to that. What we haven't finished is the work on the security aspects of it. But on the DREAM Act, the president is committed. And as we also know, at our first meeting, the debt ceiling meeting, the president said, if I get the DREAM Act, I will sign it into law. At the next meeting.
That was the DREAM Act. That was the Durbin-Graham bill, not any modification. I just say one more thing here. What happened, the president said what he said the day after, and go look it up. Mulvaney confirmed that what we said when we came out was accurate. That's Mulvaney.
What he said today.
Yeah.
He wouldn't hesitate to disagree with the president, but he agreed with him that day.
Okay. And here's the bottom line. The hard right doesn't want to do dreamers. Will the president stand up for what he knows is the right thing to do against the hard right? Or is he going to let the hard right kill it? And that's relevant to what we're talking about here. The president has a choice. And that is, does he go along with the hard right, which he has for his first 8 months or 9 months, and his presidency's been a failure and he's gotten nothing done as a result? Because what the hard right believes, whether it's on health care or taxes, is not what America believes. That's why they're trying to hide this. They didn't come out and say, we're proud to cut Medicare to reduce the deficit. They didn't even tell you about it. We had to bring it up. They don't come out and say, today we had, Gary Cohn, who knows better, saying the wealthy are not getting a tax break. They can't tell the truth about their plan because they know it's so unpopular. What would be an honest debate is they say, look, we believe when we cut taxes on the wealthy people that there's going to be a lot of job growth. Now, we can argue that. I've pointed out Kansas as the experiment that failed. But at least they'd have an honest argument. But they don't, whether it's dreamers or whether it's health care or whether it's tax reform. They're afraid to say what they're really proposing because the American people are so far away from the hard right that nothing the hard right wants will pass. And that is going to be true of tax reform as well. Thank you.
Last, we're going to take the last. They are putting out this message as well, the same folks who helped us defeat their monstrosity of health reform. But I'll say one thing, what everybody has said here, this is deceptive. It is reckless. It is wrong for our country.
Yeah, last comment for Ron Wyden, and then we've got to go vote.
Thank you to both leaders. Both Andrew and Laura, I think, are touching on this question of can you predict what it is they're going to do? What we've seen again and again when there are two forks in the road, they take the most extreme one and they walk all over even the history of the people they most admire. I got to tell you, this tax plan that the Republicans have offered makes Ronald Reagan look like a rabid socialist. Ronald Reagan said for purposes of taxes, we're going to treat somebody with a wage and investments exactly the same way. So I think both Andrew, you and Laura both have asked the same question. Every time we get to a fork in the road, they take the most extreme approach and they walk all over, frankly, the history of those Republicans they say they most admire.
Thank you, everybody.